it, it, I keep saying how much I enjoyed that study on First Peter. But all good things must come to an end. And so we're beginning a series of lessons. Uh, I have entitled this A Brief History of the Church. Um, and it has got to be just the most absolute survey of surveys. We'll probably go through, I'm thinking, all the spring and summer, at least all the way to early August, if not mid to late August. Kind of depends on how many lessons get interrupted, or we spread out one particular topic more than at least a couple of weeks. But each one, as you look at the lesson outline, as I have handed out to you, that 8.5 by 11, the white sheet, every one of these subdivisions of church history could take an entire semester. And particularly if you are more in depth, getting more in depth into church history, you're kind of making that your life goal. They could be subdivided even further. So we're talking about, we will spend, if we go through the middle of August, we will spend somewhere in the range of 15, 16 weeks. Probably that will account to maybe about 8 hours of study, maybe a little bit more, compared to 45 hours of study if we broke each one of these into an entire semester with 3 hours of class time per week. So that just tells you how brief and how much of a survey this class is going to be. I know that, at least in my past, even trying to think about having a class on church history was just absolutely frowned on. You're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to waste your time studying church history. So this was a request, and one that I jumped on immediately because even though I'm not a professional historian, I love history, and I am enamored with history. I'm enamored with the lessons that we can learn from history and hopefully make ourselves a better, wiser, stronger people by learning from our history. But why do we study history knowing full well that we can't do anything about it? It's water under the bridge, right? It's gone. It's done. Why? What's it? Okay. It explains who we are today. Secular history, religious history, doesn't matter. Any of you hear the quotation from Henry Ford that history is bunk? Apparently, Henry Ford really didn't want to look back. His entire mental functioning was looking forward. What's today and what's tomorrow?
Paul,
Yes.
when we were looking, I think, at Jeremiah 9, there was a part in there that said the people were going in the wrong direction. They needed to go in a different direction. That, to me, indicates that we need to get a direction and check our direction.
Yes.
And brings to mind what a person who was teaching children history said his answer to the question of why we study history was because we build on the past. And I see that direction in the Bible. We are giving things to build on. And we can look at how people have built on the past in Christianity and understand how to get our direction refined and
Yes.
organized.
Yeah. It's not that we want to, as one of my instructors kind of expressed it, we don't want to build a temple where our forefathers pitched a tent. But by looking at where they pitched their tent, we can decide, we can learn, was that a good decision? Was it a bad decision? Like, I like the way that you express that. We refine our direction.
Paul,
Yes.
you mentioned Henry Ford. I imagine that he used history whether he thought about it or not, because he worked on this, it didn't work, so he tried something different. Well, we know from history what didn't work. So we use history whether we know it or not.
So I, to a certain extent, to a tiny itty bitty little extent, I understand why people are hesitant to study history. They think that it's counterproductive, particularly in the church. You know, we're supposed to be focused on today, and we're supposed to be focused on the second coming of Christ, and so why are but it's when you really kind of stop and think about the Bible, how much of the Bible is history? Well, certainly Genesis through Esther, and that's the history of the Jewish people. The book of Acts. Why did Luke sit down and write, well, the his two volume, Luke and Acts? He was writing to Theophilus to tell Theophilus what happened and how it happened and why it happened. There's a, I don't know how many of you have read the story Watership Down. Anybody ever?
It's been a long, long time, I guess.
What's the story of Watership Down about?
Isn't that the one that had the rabbits?
Yes. Yes, it's I don't remember everything about it, but this community of rabbits have to move from one warren or one field or whatever, considerable distance away. And throughout their journey, one of the older, wiser, senior rabbits teaches them how to negotiate this long journey by telling stories, repeating stories from the past. And it's by repeating stories from the past that the next generation of rabbits learns how to live. A beautiful, beautiful parable. I can't even remember who wrote it. But anyway, it's a beautiful parable of the importance of history. That we today learn how to deal with problems because we know the stories of our past. Another little tidbit before we get into the lesson today. It's a funny thing how studying history sometimes bites us in the rear end, because we have this imagined world of our history, and then when we really get into our history, it's like, wait a minute, I didn't think I was that way. For instance, I hear a lot of individuals today really trumpeting and promoting and advocating for individual states' rights. You know, we are a confederation of individual states, and so individual states have their rights. And yet when you go back, by elevating states' rights, they want to minimize the power of the federal government. Federal government shouldn't tell us what we can and cannot do. And yet when you go back to the Civil War, it was the Republicans who said we need a really, really, really strong federal government to tell these southern rebellious states that they cannot secede. and so those who are arguing for a really, really, really strong federal government typically, although not exclusively, are Democrats, which back in the 1800s was saying, no, we have the individual right to secede if we want to secede. And it's the Republicans who are saying, no, individual states' rights, individual states' rights. We need a more diminished federal government. And yet it was Abraham Lincoln who said, no, it's the federal government that tells individual states whether they can secede or not. So it's just kind of a funny way that sometimes in the stream of history, we end up on one side of the bank and sometimes we're on the other side of the bank. And this has happened.
Sometimes we just throw fluff up in the air and confuse everybody. It's just like the southern states preached states' rights, but there was an article in the Southern Constitution that says no state shall abolish slavery.
Yeah. History, we like to think of history as being black and white, monolithic. And history is full of really, really gray areas.
So human history and church history, you can't separate the two.
Exactly.
Probably even in the first century, but more dynamically after the first century, the church evolved from being a spiritual institution to a human institution that allowed specific individuals or economies to dominate.
Yeah.
And that has been the case since probably the Restoration movement.
As we go through this survey, I really want to point out, and Dennis is absolutely correct, how secular history both impacted church history and to a certain extent church history impacted, especially in the early, basically from the Nicene period. So very, very quickly, let's look at these. The apostolic, the early church fathers typically is viewed to go up through, say, 100, 125, somewhere along in there, AD. These are not baked into, and that's my little comment there. Every historian has his or her own opinions. So some of these years can vary by 50, 75 years, but these are ballpark years. The apostolic early church fathers, around about 100, first century. The ante, and this means before Nicene, not ANTI, but ANTE, Nicene period, from about 100 to 325. This period of time is really significant as it relates to the development of the canon, what we consider to be in our Bible and what's not in our Bible. And so the church leaders were wrestling with really what is inspired scripture and what is not inspired scripture. This was also a period in which the church really took very strong stand on who was a heretic and who was not a heretic. Now that is in every epoch, but because what we consider to be the Bible, the canon of Scripture, was in flux. Some books were in, some books were out. They're really, at this particular point in time, they couldn't go and say everybody everywhere accepts these books. And so there was a wide range of heretical teachings, some of which were very popular, others not so much. Then the period of Nicene history, basically beginning with the Council of Nicaea. And it was, Nicaea was, if it wasn't the absolute first universal, well, you would say in Acts chapter 15, that was the first council. But Nicaea was, if not the first, one of the first major councils in which leaders from the church from all over the world got together and said, okay, this is what we believe. And if you believe this, you're a Christian. If you don't believe this, you're not a Christian. And so if you've heard of the Nicene Creed, now there were, for instance, the Apostles' Creed preceded the Nicene Creed, but the Nicene Creed is generally considered one of the first official documents. This period really was the rise of the papacy. Around about the year 300, somewhere along in there, and I will clarify this, I should have earlier. Constantine more or less declared that Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire. And it was during this time frame in which the papacy really began to assert its power, because if you're the head of the church and the church is the only official religion of the Roman Empire, the Pope really began to have a lot of power, not only over the church, but also over secular roles as well. Now, the Roman Catholic Church is going to go back way beyond 325 and say, you know, Peter was the first pope, and then this one, then that one, then the other one. But it's really around about 300 is when the papacy really begins to take off. The medieval period, from 600 to 1100, this is the rise of monasticism, and also we hear of Muhammad and the rise of Islam. And so the medieval period is very significant in the development of what we recognize as Christianity worldwide, and the Crusades trying to, the Islamic people taking over Jerusalem, Constantinople, and then the Christians I can't think of the word, instigating the Crusades to try to take back Jerusalem and the places in the East. And so that had a huge impact on the church. The Middle Ages, from 1100 to 1300, this is when the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church divide. One of the very, very, very few dates that I have memorized, 1054, with the Pope and the Patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church say, okay, we're not the same church anymore. And so we're going to talk about why they divided, and what kind of influence that has over the worldwide church today. You've got the Patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. And everybody keeps talking about, when are you ever going to get back together? Ain't going to happen. It just ain't going to happen. The second, the Middle Ages are divided into the early Middle Ages and the late Middle Ages. The late Middle Ages, really with the of all the things that I miss losing the most, I miss my mind. If I could have my mind back. Enlightenment, that's what I'm trying to think of. The Enlightenment and Erasmus and the rediscovery of the ancient languages and that sort of thing, beginning around about 1300. There again, I'm not going to argue about dates if you're a better historian than I am. Going up through the 1500s, which leads us then into, and typically the Reformation is broken into two different halves. The Reformation of Germany, which obviously is Martin Luther, the Reformation in Switzerland, which is Zwingli and John Calvin, which then leads us into our modern world from about 1800 to 1950. And I'm going to suggest that round about the late 1900 or mid 1900s, 1950, somewhere along in there, this new idea of postmodernism came along and how that has impacted the church. So any questions about any of these dates? There again, I don't want to put any of these dates in solid concrete. They're very fluid. Looking at this map, there are some things that I want to point out about this map, and from time to time I might refer back to this map. You notice well, it should be on your copy, a little red line, great big loopy line. If you notice, that is what and I can't remember what book I got this out of, but the editors have identified as the boundary of the Roman Empire. You want to talk about a Caesar having vast control over a huge chunk of the world. The Roman Empire was just massive. And the areas in brown are the areas in which the church had been established at least by the end of the first century. Now, I've got a couple of bones to pick with this, because we are told and I didn't jot that reference down, and I just saw it. Paul tells us that he had traveled all the way to Illyricum. Now, Illyricum, if you look pretty much in the middle of the page, maybe a little bit above half, but as far as right and left is concerned, Illyricum is right there, and there's a little town underneath it, Salfa or something. So Paul tells us that, and I believe this is in the book of Romans, that he has traveled as far as Illyricum. And so there is nowhere else in the East that he can travel and preach without already talking to and preaching to individuals who have already heard the gospel. So he wants to go to Rome. And from Rome, then he wants to travel across the Mediterranean Sea and end up in Spain. So I don't know why they did not put a brown area around Illyricum, maybe from Illyricum down to Berea, the area of Macedonia that they have colored in yellow. Then the area that they have colored in yellow is the extent of Christian communities by almost the end of the second century, 185. So you can see how Christianity spread. And there again, I kind of have a bone to pick. They probably could have colored a whole lot more of the eastern area brown than they did. I think they're being a little bit conservative in terms of the spread of the Roman of the church by the end of the first century. I think the early Christians did a far better job of spreading the gospel than what this little map indicates. But there are some cities that we want to highlight. The first, obviously, is Jerusalem. Down there in the bottom right corner, well, not bottom right corner, but lower right corner. Up above that largest area of brown that's highlighted there, you see a town, you see a city by the name of Byzantium. Byzantium. Anybody know what's significant about the city of Byzantium? Okay. Byzantium later became known as Constantinople, named after Constantine. Constantinople. Constantinople became the leading city of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Constantinople then was renamed Istanbul. All right, so we've got Byzantium, we've got Constantinople, we've got Istanbul. It's the same place, just kind of like St. Petersburg and what's St. Petersburg?
Leningrad.
Leningrad, thank you. Every time you have a change in leadership, you don't want to call it St. Petersburg anymore. You want to call it Leningrad, all right? Have they renamed it? Has it gone back to St. Petersburg? No, I think Leningrad is still Leningrad. It seemed like there was a Russian city that they actually went back and renamed it to its ancient name, but I have to double check on that. Okay, so that's Jerusalem and Byzantium. The third city, obviously, is Rome, way over here, up and down Italy. yeah, Rome is in Italy. I was trying to read sideways. Rome became the seat of the papacy, the Roman Catholic Church. And then down at the bottom, kind of the end of the circle, Alexandria in Egypt. Alexandria played a huge role in the development, the growth of the Christian church for a couple of reasons. Number one, there was a huge population of Jews in Alexandria. And so it was a natural place for the Christians to travel to, and because the Jews many Jews accepted Christianity as the ultimate development of their faith, that's an area in which, particularly in the south, for Egypt, and a lot of conflicts developed between the leading churchmen of Alexandria and Rome. The Egyptians and the Romans didn't always see eye to eye, and so you would have a bishop of Rome disagree with the bishop of the bishop of Rome disagreeing with the bishop of Alexandria, And as the papacy got more powerful, the Bishop of Alexandria didn't always accept the Bishop of Rome's authority. Neither did the bishops on the far east, Jerusalem, Byzantium. And so, looking back over 2,000 years, we can see their disagreements, and we can maybe kind of chuckle a little bit, but back then it was deadly serious. Okay, very quick. So that's the geography, and we want to keep this in mind. So when we talk about the Eastern Church, we're talking about Jerusalem, Byzantium, Antioch. We're talking about those leading cities. Maybe even Alexandria, although Alexandria was a very fiercely independent region. When we talk about the Western Church, we're talking about Rome and further directions to the west. Some names that we want to bear in mind as being important in this first century. Clement lived apparently between 30 and 100 AD. Many people believe, there is a famous letter from Clement to the Corinthians. And because of what is said in the letter, there are some obvious connections to the Apostle Paul. And in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 3, Paul mentions a Clement. And so this letter to the Corinthians is fascinating because of the references that Clement makes to the instructions that the Corinthians had already received from the Apostle Paul. Ignatius, between 30 and 107, wrote a bunch of letters that we still have, about 15 of them apparently. Polycarp apparently knew John, was an associate of John, although he would have been a very young man and John would have been a very old man. But he wrote a letter to the Philippians that we have a copy, or at least copies of. Polycarp is also very well known for his martyrdom. I suppose if you're going to be well known for something, martyrdom is something you might be, but I'd really rather be known for something more than my death. But anyway, the martyrdom of Polycarp is one of the really well-known events of this first century. Papias apparently was an associate of John, but in his letters, we just have fragments of his letters. He refers to John the presbyter. And if you go back and you look at 2nd and 3rd John, John identifies himself as John the elder. Now, is John the elder the same person as the Apostle John? Many people do. In fact, I tend to believe that the author of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John is the same author as the Gospel of John. But he is referred to as the elder. And Papias refers to the John that he knows as John the presbyter. So a little bit of question there. The other thing that I probably should mention in terms of church history all the way back into the 1st century is the fact that we don't have a lot of crystal clear connections. Now, a true church historian would probably argue with me there. being as it is that I am not a what I would consider to be a true church historian, I'm not going to make statements that eventually I totally have to back up and disavow. Okay, why are these individuals important? Why is this period of time so important? Number one, these individuals, Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, Papias, and several others. These are not the only ones, but several others. Their proximity to the apostles. All right. These individuals are eyewitnesses to the eyewitnesses. They're one step removed. They were not eyewitnesses to Christ. They were not alive to witness, certainly not the birth, but even the death of Jesus. But they were alive enough to have conversed with, like for instance, Clement. If the writer of Clement to the Corinthians is the exact same Clement that Paul refers to in Philippians 4:3, we have a direct connection to an apostle. Polycarp, many believe, knew the apostle John. Papias refers to the presbyter John. And so these individuals were eyewitnesses to eyewitnesses. Number two, it is through these writings that we can see how the church wrestled with what writings should be in the canon, what writings should be in our scripture, what writings should not be in our scripture, because they would refer to a writing and they would make reference to a particular writing as being worthwhile to study and a particular writing not being worthwhile to study. And so, as we mentioned earlier, these first 300 years, 350 years, the church was really struggling with what books do we consider to be inspired words of God and what are totally spurious. So, negatively here, they wrote about and included some really weird stuff. For instance, Clement, in this letter to the Corinthians, tells the story of the phoenix bird. Y'all know what the phoenix bird is?
It's a mythical bird.
Yeah, Manuel?
Mythical bird that dies and burns itself and comes back.
Yeah. The phoenix lives for 500 years and then it dies. And apparently from the dead bird, there's a worm that comes out, and the worm then becomes another bird, and it flies to Heliopolis in Egypt and all. Well, we love that Clement knew Paul, and he quotes Paul's letter to the Corinthians, and he quotes all these other letters. And then he tells this really bizarre story of the phoenix as if it's true. And so, like I said, when you get into history, you got to accept some twists and turns. They repeated a lot of hearsay. I heard somebody who heard John say. I heard somebody who heard Paul say. And so there's a lot of hearsay in these letters. Number three, all right? These writers in the first century, towards the tail end of the first century, are the real bridge from the apostles to what we refer to as the sub-apostolic church. There probably has never been a more significant shift in church history than this first from the eyewitnesses to Jesus to those who absolutely had to depend upon the statements of the eyewitnesses. If you could go and talk to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, all right? Maybe you even witnessed the tail end of Jesus' life. You didn't have to depend on faith. You could talk to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and she could tell you the stories of Jesus growing up. You didn't have to accept those stories by faith. Now we're in a time frame where the eyewitnesses of Jesus are all dead or dying. So you have to rely on somebody who heard, and even Paul by this time is dead. Most of the apostles by the end of the first century are dead. John, even if we take the longest guesstimate of John's life, he was dead by 90 or 95. All right, so you're having to believe, you're having to trust the message of the eyewitnesses to the eyewitnesses. And so really there never has been in church history a more, the word liminal. What is a threshold? What is a threshold?
Held in thrush.
Divide. What is it? A threshold marks the what is outside to what is inside, right? Why did the groom pick up the bride and carry her across the threshold? What significance does that have? This is our old life. This is our new life. I'm transporting you into a new life. This time frame is the threshold for the church. We're moving from an old generation to a new generation. And really, now there have been some really massive, significant events in church history. None, I'm going to say none as significant as this apostolic to early church to ante-Nicene, which we will get into then next week. And so, by the way, if you have any questions regarding this subject, please get them to me so that I can address them in future lessons. Like I said, we'll be going through this probably through early August, but I want to make sure that I cover all the questions that you all may have regarding this subject. We are out of time. In fact, we're way past out of time, so let's take a break and get ready for our worship services.